Thank you, Brian. I'm happy to be one of those 600 or 700 Prius conversions driving around, and David is right, it works great. It's an honor to be here, and thanks to the organizers for putting together this terrific conference. I'm seeing so many familiar faces now. I think this industry is really beginning to become a community, which is really terrific to see. And I also love the title of this morning's session, which is about a national strategy around electrification of transportation, because I think that's something that we really need for reasons that we'll talk about. But for a few minutes, I'll tell you about Better Place. I'm sure a lot of you know a little bit about Better Place. We were founded about 2 years ago by Shai Agassi, and founded really in a very mission-driven way, with the mission being to end oil, and to figure out the answer to the question, how do you run a country without oil? And what Shai aimed to do was to create a situation where the electric car, pure electric car, would be less expensive than the alternative and more convenient to the consumer. And in that scenario, the thesis goes, the consumer will continue to pay the operating costs that they're accustomed to today. So how do you make the car less expensive? The first thing you do is take the battery out of the equation, because we see the battery not actually as a component of the car, but rather as an energy source, as really more part of the infrastructure as we view crude oil today. And so Better Place takes on the ownership of all the batteries, and separates the batteries not only for ownership, but also physically separates the batteries to enable range extension, to answer the question, what do you do when you want to go on a trip that's longer than the range of the battery and you don't want to have to wait? And how do you make it more convenient? And here's where a lot of confusion often comes in, because we're so well known now for this notion of battery switch, which is still to some extent controversial, I guess. But what people often forget is that that's not the primary way in which we view getting electrons into the car. The primary way is charging. And so the first thing that we do actually is to put charge spots fairly ubiquitously at home, at work, and then a certain amount of public infrastructure as well. And so most of the time, people feel as if they have a terrific contract with Chevron, that someone follows them around and tops them off every time they stop. And they can start every trip with the full range of the battery and only go to the switch station to do the 1 minute battery exchange on trips that exceed the 100, 120 mile range of the battery. So in doing this, we've created, we hope, what we call the E-mile, the mile on electricity. And the cost of that mile, we calculate as the depreciation of the battery plus the electricity. And according to the cost that we hope Dave and others will provide us with in a couple of years when we go live, we expect to be competitive on a 25 mile per gallon car with about $2 a gallon gasoline, which makes us competitive really throughout the world, but obviously a more attractive business option where gas is more expensive, which is the common denominator with the countries in which we've already begun to deploy, which is Denmark, Israel, and Australia. And that's a policy issue, as was talked about a little bit on the first panel, and I'm sure we'll talk about more that this country has to think about in terms of how to overcome what is, in this industry, a disadvantage of having priced fuel relatively inexpensively for so long. We have one major OEM partner at the moment, which is Renault, and the Renault-Nissan Alliance. And we had a milestone, they had a milestone, and we had a milestone last month at the Frankfurt Motor Show. They are midway through the 4-year production cycle on the first battery switch mass-produced car, which is called the Renault Fluence. It's a 5-passenger luxury sedan. And they debuted it at the auto show. 2 years from now, it'll be in mass production, and it'll go to consumers in Israel and Denmark and elsewhere. And we had a milestone as well. We announced that we've contracted with Renault to purchase at least 100,000 of these cars over the 5 years beginning after the mass production commences. And we also demonstrated our software, which is fairly sophisticated. It's a very big asset for us that we have pedigree in the software industry to a great degree within our company, and that answers a lot of the questions that the first panel talked about in terms of how do you assure that you don't overload the grid. And our answer to that is through software, is through using a very sophisticated algorithm when that car plugs in to know what priority it is in charging and to communicate with the utility and say how much electricity is available to charge now without having to get into additional generation. And to marry all of those equations in a way that we can charge a large amount of cars without adversely impacting the grid. And so, and as was also talked about a little bit in the first panel, we also think once you get these cars out in mass production and they're connected to a grid, and that grid has communication ability, then you've created what is the missing element in scaling renewable electricity, which is storage. And so the ability to combine the storage that we need for renewable electricity with the batteries that we need to drive our cars, we think is going to be one of the most important elements in this revolutionary transformation that we'll all see unfold over the next decade. And we look forward to being a part of that with all these wonderful companies.